So good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to the December 1st Wednesdays. My name is Mark Cumming. I'm the head of COLOV. And COLOV, for those of you who are maybe joining us for the first time, is the association of people involved in international development work. And we host these First Wednesday discussions with the view to kind of connecting people who are involved in local activism in Ireland with international global justice issues. And then at the same time, in return, people who have been involved in work in the Global South, that they take their energy and they connect that up to activism here in Ireland when they come home. So this is the third of a series of First Wednesdays on the theme of climate change and COP. And it's the first time that we've actually packaged a number of First Wednesdays together, and we're really pleased. The first one in October was the Voices of Youth, with young people from Ireland, Rwanda, and First Nations communities in Canada. And then in November, it was the voice of the elders, with a wonderful interview with Shirley from, again, First Nations community in Canada. And now tonight, a wonderful lineup who will be introduced to you now in a moment. We're delighted to partner with the Department of International Development Studies in Maynooth University, and again, having their staff involved and as the moderator for these nights. And again, thank you, Eilish, tonight. Eilish is the head of department, and she'll be our moderator. I'll take over now in a moment. Do post comments and questions and queries in the function there on the right hand side of the YouTube, and they'll be fed to Eilish over the course of the evening, and she will engage our panel with them. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you're interested to find out more about COLOV, check out colov.org. And if you're interested to get involved and join and take part in the work of the various membership activist groups, do check us out. And if you're time poor and you've a bit of cash to spare, do think about donating to our work. And finally, before I hand over to Eilish, just to thank Concern Worldwide, who support COLOV in hosting these nights. So Eilish, over to you and to our wonderful panel, and look forward to enjoying this evening. Thank you.
Brilliant, Mark. Thanks a million. So just to welcome everybody to this first Wednesday on behalf of the Maynooth University Department of International Development and COLOV, like Mark said. This series is the Coping with COP series, and tonight's iteration of that is about community activists and where to next. And over the past 2 months, as Mark was saying, our first Wednesdays have been inspired and humbled by youth leaders and by wisdom of indigenous eldership. And since then, the COP Summit has been and gone. And we're wondering if such voices, who were also present in the corridors and on the streets of Glasgow, are being listened to. And of course, we know, unfortunately, we're still on an unsustainable path with levels of global warming, the effects of warming already being felt on the world's poorest, and many have already lost their lives, and witnessing the ebbing away of a future in the present time. So there appears to be little or no shift in terms of the mainstream policy discourse. And I'm going to talk to community activists and climate justice activists tonight about, I suppose, their take on what has happened and whether there is a sense of challenging the economic growth models and corporate interests, or really are we just on a path to doom? In a recent article in The Guardian, George Monbiot argued that the Glasgow Climate Pact, for all, this is what he said, for all its restraint and diplomatic language, he said it looks like a suicide pact. After so many squandered years of denial, distraction, and delay, he said, it's too late for incremental change. What we got, he argues, was compromise with the global fossil fuel industry and prevarication. But he asks, does this mean we might as well give up? And suggests, no, it doesn't. For just as the complex natural systems on which our lives depend can flip suddenly from one state to another, so can the systems that humans have created. Like natural systems, if they're driven beyond their tipping point, they can flip with astonishing speed. And he gives the example of the crisis in the United States in 2008, a small disturbance, he said, which actually really triggered a massive response. And he suggests that this could be the property to detonate positive change. So with the very strong, I suppose, sense of the challenges that remain after COP, but also trying to identify what we can do, what's possible. We have three really, really interesting panelists who will explore these issues a little bit further this evening. From the previous two sessions, I've learned so much, and I have no doubt that I will learn a lot more about the complexity, but also about the possibilities around all of this area this evening. And I hope you do too. And as Mark said earlier on, please feel free to post any comments or suggestions that you have in the YouTube function there, because I'll bring them to the panelists as we go along. So our three panelists this evening, the first person we have here is Teresa O'Donoghue, who's a mother of five and a climate activist living in County Clare. Teresa co-founded Future Proof Clare, Transition Ireland and Northern Ireland, as well as various other groups since 2006, as she's moved across Ireland. Her aim has always been to raise a flag so that climate activists can find allies and collaborate without blame, building a better world. So you're very welcome, Teresa, and thanks very much for joining us this evening. Our second panelist is Vincenza Sariface, and she's currently researching resistance to extractivism in the Sperrins Mountains in Northern Ireland for NUIG. Vincenza is involved in the climate justice movement through groups including Shirley Alphonse, the Galway Feminist Collective, and the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. Welcome as well, Vincenza. And finally, welcome to Sean Mccabe, who's the Executive Manager of the Task Climate Justice Centre. Sean has participated in First Wednesdays in the past. His work at Task focuses on developing evidence-based, people-centred and community-led climate action strategies. So again, thanks very much to all of you for your contributions this evening. Just a word on the format for those of you who are joining us for the first time. We try to keep this very informal, really. And my role really is to give space to our panelists to contribute, to talk to us about their experiences, and to, I suppose, to help us to understand the issues better and focus a little bit on ways forward. So I'll just field a few questions to them and give them space to do that as much as possible. And I look forward to hearing from you as well. And as I say, I'll field some of those questions. So let's start, really. Oh, enough from me. And maybe I could start with you, Teresa, if you wouldn't mind. I'm going to ask you all just to tell us a little bit more about your work. I just said a little bit about it there, but maybe, Teresa, if you could start, if you would tell us a little bit about your climate justice activism with Future Proof Clare, what you're working on, maybe specifically, and why that's important. Thanks a million.
Okay, well, all of my work originates from Transition Ireland and Northern Ireland, going back to 2006 when I found out how bad things were with climate, and then got involved in the exact same stuff Sean is in the midst of, but a bit community-led climate action and climate justice, because I see that that's the only solution insofar as the democratic process goes, and time again that's played out as government-led solutions are coming up against community resistance, and that's feeding into a whole other democratic deficit. So I have been supporting anyone who wants to get involved in climate action and climate justice since then. So that tends to be wherever I go, I find out who else is involved or and wants to get involved. And that's what happened in Clare about 6 years ago. I moved to Clare. This is where my dad's family is from, so lots of people down here. So this is my last move. Somebody suggested I move around the country and just set up a new place everywhere I go, just get the ball rolling. But so Future Proof Clare, we set it up as a transition initiative for Clare to encourage people to get involved in community-led climate action. Then one of our first things was we had a load of civil servants come across from Europe to meet with local authorities here and talk about sustainable development. Then Shannon LNG became a big issue, and all of a sudden we're firefighting. So that tends to be what happens when you become a climate activist, is you have great intentions of changing things where you live, and then there's just so many things coming at you, so many more threats continuously happening. I mean, we're involved with what's going on in the Sperrin Mountains now, we're involved with data centres, we're still involved with Shannon LNG, and we're trying to do community-led climate action. So that's kind of what I do, is collaborate, communicate, and get involved. I had to get involved with policy because the policy kind of blocks everything we want to do at community level, but that's changing.
That's brilliant. Teresa, sorry, I had myself muted there, and I was frantically writing down some stuff that you were saying. I was really interested in two pieces in particular that struck me. One is about that thing about government-led solutions coming up against kind of communities. Whereas, of course, you know, in theory, government is supposed to work to support communities, but it sounds like that's not necessarily your experience in that regard. Maybe you might say more about that at a later stage. And the other thing then that you were mentioning about the wanting to do long-term preparatory work, but actually this firefighting kind of thing, that there's constantly something happening. So anyway, I'm just responding to what you said. Maybe you might want to say a bit more about those later on. I'll pass over for now to Vincenza. Will you tell us a little bit about your work and your research with those who are resisting extractivism in the Sperrins? Thanks, Emil.
Yeah, thanks so much. Lovely to be here with everyone. It's great to be part of this series, which has had some amazing speakers so far. So I've been really lucky, I guess, to organise in different groups, like you mentioned, Diela and the Feminist Collective and the Environmental Gathering here in the North, and also some divestment movement. But yeah, at the minute I'm doing a PhD looking at community resistance to extractivism in the Sperrins. So yeah, it's really like amazing thing to be able to work with the really strong and inspiring communities there that are resisting Dalradian Gold, which is a Canadian gold mining company. And I'm also part of a network called KM, which has recently set up. It's Communities Against the Injustice of Mining, and it's actually an all-island network. So it's communities that are facing mining, prospecting, or licenses in their community. It's a network, like a grassroots network of support for them. So that's been a really great experience to be involved in. With them, and I think it's really important because Ireland's been identified as this hotspot in the European mining boom, and a lot of the north and the south has been already concessioned for mineral licenses, which is pretty worrying, I think, at this time. So that's kind of what I've been working on at the minute, and I'm actually in London at the minute. We're here with a group from the Sperrins, and we're going to be doing some actions in the next few days across the city at different strategic places like the Crown Estates, which actually owns all the precious metals in the north, and they give the licenses as well, and targeting the headquarters of Orion Mining Finance, which is the sort of overall controller of Dalradian, and we're going to send them an eviction notice as well tomorrow, so looking forward to that.
Okay, brilliant, Vincenza, thanks very much. So you said that all the concessions for minerals in the north and south are pretty much gone. Is that what you said?
Well, yeah, there's 25% of the north and 27% of the south has already been concession for mineral licenses, you know, so there's like the potential for exploration and mining in those areas, it's quite a huge area, you know.
That's a quarter, basically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sure other things will come up around all of that at a later point. That's brilliant, Vincenza. Thanks a million. And Sean, maybe just give us a little bit of background into your own work, please.
Thanks, Ailish, and thanks for organising this. It's great to be here. I guess the focus of my work is really maybe at this point trying to stop talking about climate change a little bit and start talking about local development and communities being able to build their own local wealth and their own development prospects, and returning that agency that exists, like empowering the agency that exists within communities so that they can realize outcomes that really are better than, as Teresa says, this sort of top-down government-led approach that tends to meet with resistance. We in Task, just before COP, we published a survey that we'd done with Red Sea in June, which kind of underscored the need to stop talking about climate change, in that the majority of respondents put climate change last in a list of 10 concerns that they face, because stacked up against issues like housing, like healthcare, like just transport or the proficient spending of public funds, climate change does not rank highly. I think there's a need for the climate justice movement to understand that, and to understand then how we engage communities in a way that reaches them where they're at. So there's a lot of that is the focus of my work at the minute, as is working at the international level with an initiative called the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, which focuses on rights-based approaches to the climate and environmental crises. It's led by David Boyd, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to a Healthy Environment. It's a coalition of organizations, including youth-led organizations, trying to embed that sort of rights focus. And there's a really exciting, just a plug here, today we just soft launched a website on the new general comment that the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child will be putting together on environment and climate change. And there's a consultation that we've just opened up to try to get impressions, particularly impressions from children and young people around the world, into what their environmental rights should look like. And it'd be good for people to check that out. It's children. I'll find the URL when I'm not talking.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, great. Thanks very much. Thanks to all of you for those really interesting introductions. And I'm really struck by the emphasis on the kind of community activism and agency, which you pulled out there as well, Sean. And I suppose coming from an international development perspective and having very much a kind of a concern about what we do at a community level, that's hooked into more broader global processes, I'm going to bring us a little bit back to COP, just to kind of make the connection. And I'd like to hear from you, I suppose, your impressions of COP and how you feel about the whole thing. I introduced George Monbiot's kind of, somewhat depressing, but also attempt to be hopeful take on the whole thing. And so I'd just like to hear from you. What were your impressions of it? Maybe what did you think was, I'm just going to leave it at that. What did you think of the whole thing? I don't mind who starts. Who'd like to start? Sean, do you want to start, since we spoke to you last, or are you frantically
okay, yeah, No, I have it here, but it's just childrightenvironment.org. But in terms of what I thought about COP, I guess it wasn't my first rodeo. I've been to a lot of COPs. I didn't go in expecting a lot, and so I wasn't that disappointed. I think we have to be realistic about what COP is. It was fantastic to see the focus on it that bubbled up this year. I think the pandemic helped with that, as did it being in Scotland. But COPs are very slow-moving processes of consensus with all the countries in the world, let alone the private sector interests that then are at play as well. But they're at play at the national level in all of our governments. So this is just a larger demonstration of that. And it's about setting the macro rules by which we will hopefully all operate. So in terms of what COP can do, there's very real things it can do in terms of setting ambition. COP26 came up shockingly short on that, but we knew that going in because the countries had already submitted their nationally determined contributions, which is, the basis of the Paris Agreement. And we knew going in that they were, the increases being proposed were a magnitude of 10 less than what's necessary to get us on a 1.5 degree pathway. So pathetically insignificant. We also know that, I think the real advantage of COP and the real advantage of the multilateral process, and the multilateral process is important. I think we've a risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater sometimes when we get angry at these processes, because the alternative to the multilateral process is, we've seen it so many times in war and conflict. So there's real at its essence, we should be talking about decolonialization and reparations for colonialism, and that's what that process can and should be delivering. So the commitment under the Green Climate Fund of 100 billion per year, which has not been reached in Oxford, there's a lot of dodgy accounting going on around it, but we're at about 30 billion a year, which is woefully inadequate. But the UNFCCC themselves put out a report just in advance of COP, which was an assessment of all of the support required by the Global South if they are to realise their own nationally determined contributions, which is obviously a key aspect of getting us on a 1.5 degree trajectory. And that amounted to, by 2030, it amounted to 5.8 trillion. So we're struggling to get 30 billion a year mobilized, and we have to get to about 5.8 trillion, which again is a magnitude of 10 greater than what we're currently doing. We should be targeting about 300 billion a year and more in order. So we're just not being realistic at all about the figures that are involved. And just one final figure, because I think the British government went into a sort of a media overdrive spin scenario coming out of it to try to pretend like it had been a success. And one of the key figures that kept being quoted was the adaptation commitment being doubled. Now, they never talked about the actual absolute figures. They just talked about a doubling. And, like a doubling of nothing is still nothing, right? But what was doubled was about 20 billion up to about 40 billion. But the UNEP put the current adaptation gap at 70 billion. So the doubling of the adaptation funding doesn't even gets us about halfway to the current adaptation gap. Now, the UNEP estimate the adaptation gap by 2030 to be anywhere up to about 350 billion per year, just to keep people alive, right? And so, it all comes back to me, the state of vaccine inequality, right? Like, if we can't get a very simple solution rolled out globally, and we're seeing now with the Omicron variant what happens if you don't succeed in that. We really are not doing it on the climate front. So I didn't expect much from COP, but that doesn't detract from the fact that it was woefully inadequate.
It all sounds, I'm always overwhelmed by the figures, and I'm not great at, I like, you explained them very well there. And, it's very, it just seems so woefully inadequate, such a failure. And I often even wonder about this 1.5. The way we now talk about 1.5, it's like everybody knows what that means. But actually, even 1.5 isn't that great. So, and there's absolutely no way by the commitments that have been made, there's no way that the climate change will get to 1.5. So what do you do with all of that information, I suppose? And sometimes I get worried, and I can hear your concern there, Sean, about, trying to counter the spin, and that's really important. And you also said earlier on, trying to get away from the kind of the language of climate change to talking about where people are at and what it actually means in people's real life. So it just seems like, what do you do with all of that? And what do you do with all of that? I'm always wondering, what do you do with all of that overwhelming information and sense of inadequacy with the whole thing?
I'm not very hopeful about it. I think in terms of what I do personally with it, I don't plan too far into the future, realistically. I read something, I don't know who put it out yesterday or the day before, which was like, if you believe scientists and if you understand how catastrophic the impacts of climate change will be within the next 15 years, would you continue doing the job that you're doing? or would you change it? And I think that's very real. Like, it's unspeakable how close we are to, you know, and 1.5, it's gone. We're not going to make 1.5. You know, if you listen to Kevin Anderson or any of the kind of climate scientists who really are going to sort of, you know, risk being marginalized in the conversation, like, we're in dire straits. And yeah, I think that's how you deal with it. You just kind of start to reconcile with that, and you don't lose the fight or the fire, but I think it's very, very, yeah, it's nearly gone.
It's very serious. Yeah. Thanks, Sean. Vincenza, Teresa. Vincenza, maybe we'll start again with you. Just your take on copper. How do you feel about what Sean has said there?
Yeah, no, yeah, I agree with a lot of what Sean's mentioned there. You know, that, you know, like I didn't have really high hopes, you know, going into it. But yeah, I think, you know, the power is, you know, coming from outside of COP as well, you know, and it comes from the bottom up, not the top down. And I think it's really important to remember as well that it's an important event, but it's just like one event, you know, and the struggle for climate justice like takes place like every day in our movements. I think that's, yeah, important to keep in perspective. But yeah, totally agree, you know, with the greenwashing and the corporate interest that you saw there. And yeah, and I do think like it failed to listen to the voices, frontline community voices, especially from the global south. Because yeah, like we would have seen, you know, much more responsibility from the global north. And yeah, and this idea of like carbon colonialism as well, you know, where we're like taking up the space of the carbon budget of like the global south that they need. And yeah, and Sean mentioned, you know, the figures are way off as well, and that. But I guess, yeah, I kind of wanted to talk a wee bit about the idea of like green extractivism and how that was really missing from the narrative as well. And you know, we see, I think that the solutions are still like really firmly stuck in business as usual and in the market and in technological fixes and in technologies that might not even exist yet, you know. So yeah, I think that we need to like think about yeah, false solutions as well. And I guess like we're not just in an energy crisis, we're in a materials crisis as well, you know. And what we're saying is that we're just going to continue with business as usual and swap over from like a fossil fuel based system to a renewable system without understanding all of the inequalities and oppressions built into that system. So yeah, for that to happen, we're going to see like lots more mining and extractivism ramped up around the world, on indigenous people's lands, on protected areas, and as well in Europe and in the global north as well. Yeah, so I think, yeah, there's projections that we want to see there's going to be like a doubling of the materials needed into the system by 2060, which is crazy. So yeah, I think, yeah, that this is still like putting the solutions inside the system, the growth-based system, if that makes sense, you know. I just, yeah, there's a lot of talk about switching to like electric cars rather than discussions about like free and accessible public transport for everybody as well. So yeah, like we hear the youth strikers talk about climate system change, which is really important. But yeah, so yeah, we have to be kind of critical, I guess, about yeah, when we switch over to renewables, we can't mine our way out of the climate crisis, you know. We need really like foundational changes, and to talk about like different systems like degrowth and circular societies and all these different things. So yeah, I guess that's kind of what I kind of felt was missing from the discussion. But what I was really hopeful about was the COP Coalition's People Summit, you know, and they had like loads of amazing events online and in person, and the Yes to Life No to Mining network that I'm a part of. They held an amazing series of talks that you can actually watch back on their website. I really encourage people to have a look at that. That was really, yeah, really inspirational. And yeah, hopefully that ends on a wee bit of hope. But yeah, like Sean, it's not a very hopeful situation.
So that's the No to Mining network, is it, Vincenza?
Yes to life, no to mining. Yes.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So really interesting there. What's missing, but also the framing and how the framing in itself is so limited, even where there's change and transform, some kind of, promises and policies and even those inadequate funds, but it's still within the same, not only structural system, but also system of thinking. And that's back to your kind of decolonizing the way we think about all of these, I suppose, these issues, and also that intersectionality, the need to make the links, like Sean mentioned as well, that link with vaccine inequality, and whether it's about, that kind of system change, making the links across different issues. One of the things that strikes me very often is the lack of discussion at all about biodiversity. And it's like as if these things are all separate. So it's as if climate change is separate, a completely separate issue from, biodiversity loss and the destruction of native forests and woodlands and, trees and plants and everything else that we live our lives off. And you've made that point very, very strongly there with the extractivism. Thanks very much, Vincenza. Teresa, what about yourself? How did you feel? Did you have any more hope than the other two going into it?
Let's just say a little story. Back in 2006, when I did find the transition movement, it was from reading an article. I had watched, first of all, some documentary that had left me devastated about climate change. And I was reading this article, and it set out clearly the trajectory and the fact that governments aren't capable of changing this system. They're in the system, they're part of this system. There's no way they're going to change the system, definitely not to the extent that's needed. The most we can do, the least we can expect from them is nothing. We can't expect them to do it. And by community-led action and changes to build a resilient community for where you live will have two effects. It will lower emissions. It will make your economy more localized, as well as hopefully contributing to the mitigation of climate change. It will make you put your community in a better position for adaptation, because if you have your own local food supply and your energy supplies and things like that. So that's what encouraged me to join Transition. It wasn't because I thought I was going to stop climate change. It's because I knew we wouldn't stop climate change, and that I needed my community to be prepared for it. And we need our country and we need all the world to be prepared for it, because the governments are so wrapped up in capitalism, the neoliberal capitalism, absolutely take whatever we want. Few people make as much money as they like, and it doesn't give a damn about my children or anyone else's children or future generations. So I went into COP knowing that I've known that too long. And there's no way that I could take a job, actually. Not even could I give up my job. I can't actually do a job that is not climate action. It's transition, basically. I have to be working on transition, and that has been for free for 15 years, because nobody wants to pay you to work on transition or to work voluntarily in your community to build resilience. So my impression of COP was exactly what I expected, except maybe a bit more overwhelming, because when you walk into this big, huge panoramic view of IKEA furniture, that's kind of what it was. I just want to go back to the eco-anxiety. And in our group, we had John Sherry, he's a psychologist. So he is very interested in the eco-anxiety. So he was talking to the young people and getting a handle on this. And I think that's one of those things that we need to be able to be open and honest about more. I mean, more and more people are realizing that this is not going to be solved. We're definitely not going to do 1.5. I doubt very much we'll do 2. And it'll probably have to be fairly dire before governments do actually take them, or maybe they'll just be overthrown at that stage. But anxiety and eco-anxiety and depression about this whole thing is part of everyday life for so many people now. And once you know what's going on, and I'm one of the founding members actually of Untitled Climate Committee, so as well as everything else. So I'm absorbed in science once a month. I sit at a desk, a table, or a Zoom with a load of academics talking about the science of climate change. And there's no getting away from the facts. So while I have hope that we can build resilience and transition our own communities and be some way prepared for what's coming down the road. But it is so unfair. It is so unequal. The devastation that this is going to reap on people all over the world. We're probably in a much better position. It's just, it doesn't bear too much thinking about, or you would give up on life. So I try not to. I try to focus on positive. Let's do what we can locally. I wish I didn't have to firefight, and I wish I didn't have to step up and change policy and fight the policy that stops the actions we want to do locally, because that's the only reason I got involved with policy. So I couldn't put in a community garden because the council didn't like the idea. And that's when your government is fighting against you. So.
The other thing that, thanks a million for that, Teresa, and that importance, I suppose, about being transparent about sometimes the need to have this narrative of hope, but actually how difficult that can be sometimes, how important it is at the same time. So it's that kind of balance, but also to be able to name some of the real challenges that all of this presents to everybody, and at a personal level as well as at that kind of practical level, as you call it, the eco-anxiety. One of the things that has struck me very much in recent years is just about the shift from a talk or language of the future. And of course, it is going to be, there is a future kind of, I suppose, that is likely to be devastating for all of us, I guess, but also how present it all is for everybody. And it's, to watch things happening and to hear people who are experiencing the negative impacts of climate destruction, of over-extraction, of, colonization of their space, of the effects of the neoliberal system of economics on their real lived lives. And that strikes me very much, that we have moved very much from that I suppose the COP thing is all about what we will do in the future. And one of the things, this thing, we will stop fossil fuel burning by 2030 or whatever other promises. It's all like, we'll do this great stuff in the future, as if in the future we'll be able to prevent stuff. But actually things are happening now. And I just wonder what you feel about all that present future kind of dynamics and talk in relation to all of this. Teresa, do you want to say anything about that in response to, because I said that in response to what you were saying there?
I think the future, the governments are a 5-year term, looking to be voted back in again. It's everything is backloaded, front loaded, whatever it is put off as long as possible. And that's very demoralizing for those of us that are, trying to get change. That your own government is probably one of the biggest blockers to that change that needs to happen. And I hear people go on about them, the climate activists won't be happy. Not evangelists, but those of us who realize how bad it is could never be happy with what's being proposed. And there is no real middle ground when you're at that. So now I've lost track of where I was. Yeah, what was the question, Eilish?
Well, actually, I wouldn't blame you, because it was a bit of a rant, actually, to be honest with you. I was really wondering about this whole thing about the present and the future. And you were starting to say, I think that because governments are so short-term, they think short-term, and they're not willing really to make the long-term decision. Sorry, I don't want to be putting words in your mouth.
No, they don't care. And what annoys me is that no matter what, they'll end up getting their pensions, and there'll be people homeless, and it just, the whole thing really annoys me. But we need to focus ourselves on making sure that we hold them to account. We need to collaborate, we need to work together, we need to keep pushing for change. And it's sad that it is coming from the people and that the top down isn't capable of seeing that. And we have to keep them ever present. There is no escape. We should not take, we'll do it in 2030, we'll do it in 2050. We should not accept that as an answer anymore. It's way too late. They keep saying that. And this whole gas, we signed up to BOGA while we were there, forgotten what's for Oil and Gas, Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. And yet there was a statement today that's going to be 7 more gas plants put in the next 10 years. You know, I just, like, why would you push it out to another 10 years before you actually do something? And it continues to be another 5-10 years. We need to hold them to account now and ignore this, or stop them from saying we'll do it in whatever year in the future.
Thanks, Teresa. Sean, any thoughts, or I'm sure you have lots of thoughts, anything you'd like to say about the future?
I think it was really one of the closing plenary of COP was tough to watch, because what it essentially was, you know, the negotiations in Madrid 2 years earlier broke down because the developing countries reckoned that what was on the table was insufficient for them. Now, what actually happened at COP was they got something even less sufficient at COP26, but they're in such a crisis now. They realized the depth of the crisis is so great that they just felt they had to accept it and move on. They couldn't afford another year of stalling. And in the middle of it, Franz Timmermans turned around and lectured the developing countries on the risk that is posed to his grandchildren. And you're looking at this and you're like, God damn it, like, these are countries already experiencing the worst of the impacts. You know, like, another El Nino could push 60 million people into famine, right? Like, that's what we're looking at. A strong El Nino could push 60 million. And you have the European Commissioner for the European Green Deal talking about the risks that are posed to his grandchildren. And so when you talk about that future present, there, you know, it's distant in time, but it's also distant in space. Like, yeah, and anyone who's worked on development issues, international development issues over any period of time knows that the world has been perfectly happy to allow the underdevelopment of nations to continue, and knows that that is not driven by an inability of those nations to develop, but they're kept in a perpetual state of underdevelopment for the purposes of resource extraction, etc., as Vincenza was saying earlier. So, like, we're really now staring at a point where it's a bit of a, I don't know, it's not a fully formed thought yet, but it's been in my head since COP, is that there's a paper, I could dig it out, about when in Tanzania, the diamond markets first came to Tanzania and started to extract diamonds, and the local communities began to fetishize albino people as potential good luck charms in the hunt for diamonds. And so it led to the murder and death of albino Tanzanians, right? Because one bizarre fetish around the value of diamonds bred other fetishes, right? And what we're really looking at now in this moment of reckoning with 2 centuries of extraction is everything around us is a fetish. The entire value system that we live by is a fetish. None of it is real, and we actually now have to reinvent that. That's where the battle is. It's, you know, and so when we talk about we need to meet people where they're at, we need to talk about housing, we need to talk about tax justice, we need to talk about, like, we have to realize that the entire value system that we live in is based on the extraction of fossil fuels and what they have enabled. And so it's a reinvention of all of that. And so exactly like Vincenza is saying, the idea that somehow you can just switch to electric cars and renewable energy and that our problems are solved is laughable, because this is a reckoning with that extractive mindset.
Thanks, Sean. Vincenza, I'll give you a few words on this. I have a few questions coming in there. Sorry, I was slightly distracted towards the end. And if anybody else has any other questions, please put them into the chat or into the YouTube thing, and Mark will send them on to me. And I'll field these to you now in a few seconds. Some really interesting questions for you. Sorry, Vincenza.
No, that's great. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Sean, that, like the underpinning system of extractivism, it's rooted in these systems of oppression, patriarchy, colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, all of these things we need to like radically transform. So yeah, it's a huge task. But yeah, around like the now and future question, I don't know, many people probably saw this, but Vijay Prasad did a really good speech at COP, where he said that, the climate justice movement won't have any legs to stand on if we keep talking about, the future of our children, because, the children of the global south don't have a present, and I think that is so important, and we need to keep like, driving that home. But I think the messaging of the climate justice movement has shifted so much, as well, like over the last 10 years, where like those messages are coming to be more mainstream, which is really like important and good to see, I think, as well.
Say more about that there, Vincenza. Sorry, I missed that last little piece. You were saying the messaging. Sorry, say a little bit more about that, will you?
Yeah, I do think that, like, since like, I don't know, I've been involved for maybe like 10 years, and at the start, it would have been very fringe to talk about justice as part of, these climate movements. But yeah, now you see it with the youth strikers, you see it with workers' movements involved, migrants' movements involved. It's really like diversified, and it's not so white and middle class, the whole movement, which I think is amazing. When you look at like the groups that were like marching on the streets in Glasgow, there was such a diverse group of people, and that's what's really needed, I think, for the movement to be strong and to build that people power. Because it's like all of those issues that Sean was talking about. It's about reproductive justice, it's about housing, it's about so much more than just the carbon in the air. And if it's okay, I just wanted to mention one thing about the eco-anxiety thing as well. I'm part of a group called Active Hope Ireland, and that's about using Joanna Macy's work, which looks at how you can use like climate grief, to build resilient movements. Because I think the fact that we feel all these emotions shows that we're actually connected to like the living world and to other people all around the world. So it's actually a sign that like you're, I don't know, emotionally intelligent, if you feel this, because it shows our connection to the world. And it's something we need to process, definitely, like Teresa's been saying, and acknowledge a lot more.
Brilliant. I'll keep you on there for 1 sec, because the first of the questions, you might feel you've answered it, but maybe you might want to say a little bit more. Gertrude Cotter has a question there. If you have any other resources on eco-anxiety, and you've mentioned there Joanna Macy's work, and I just wonder, any of you might have resources that you might like to just even highlight a few names that people can Google, because we don't have the capacity here to share things in the chat. There's millions of questions coming through here. Okay, anyway, anybody want to say anything about any resource suggestions there?
I have so the antidote to the depression and the eco-anxiety is to get involved and to be active and to funnel those feelings to action that make you feel you're getting somewhere, at least. Now, after the climate bill, I think, recently anyway, I put together a website. It's climatecare.ie. So it's simple enough, climatecare.ie. And in that, I have, for every county, there's a list of climate action groups. There's also national groups and things like that. So if you really want, if this is getting to you, be part of the solution. Maybe not necessarily join, go on to climatecare.ie, find a group that's in your area or that you can get involved with. I think that for me is my saving grace, is the action. Otherwise, you're just left to sit with it. And I think action is it like Vincenza says, we're aware of it, and we need to be engaged in how it's addressed.
Brilliant, Teresa. Amy from Cork, at the first of the events, she made that point as well very strongly, that actually through being involved, knowing that you are doing something, and you spoke very strongly about that whole thing about like actually at a very personal and local and community level, changing your community, changing its reliance on current systems, and building resilience for, for, as you said, a further transition, that it actually can give you that kind of hope. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. Does anybody else want to say anything else about other examples of resources before we move on?
Rather than an example of a resource, Eilish, maybe just to say that I think it's really important not to get, it may be easier said than done, but like the anxiety thing comes about sort of a stress for yourself sometimes, and sometimes maybe an eco-empathy, kind of looking outside ourselves and looking at that situation of that say small island developing states are in, or places where people actually don't nearly have the time to think about the situation. They're spending so much time fighting it. And I think that's a bit of an antidote to a situation where we're not in it yet, like we're not really experiencing it yet. It's in the future for us. It's in the present for people. And yeah, like Teresa says, just being active and fighting it is where we're at. I don't think, the others are just imposters, those emotions, and should be treated as such, I think,
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Sean. The other questions that are coming in, and there's a big conversation going on. I can't actually see it, but I can see it here on my phone. You can't see it probably, between Tom O'Connor and Gertrude Cotter about politics and about the need for radical politics. So Tom's first kind of intervention around this was in response to you guys, and I'm sure many of you know Tom, fair enough for community activism, but doesn't climate need to be tackled at state level? So what about the need for alternative radical politics? How do you mobilize that? And he goes further to say, do Green parties in coalition, not only in Ireland, just slow down a radical change? Now, Sean, I'm going to go to you for that first, for reasons known to us all.
Honestly, I think that, we have an incredible issue with political inertia, driven by what Teresa said earlier about, 5-year political cycles, no sense of intergenerational equity within the political system. Really, like, as we're saying, no real commitment to end global poverty or global hunger or address a vaccine crisis. So, like, to Tom's question, 100% it needs to be solved at the national level, but it's not happening. And it, like, if we look at our own, the climate law is a significant step forward in this country, but the 51% is way short of what Europe is currently committed to under its NDC, because we're measuring off a different baseline. If we were measuring off the European baseline, we'd need to reduce by 72% by 2030. That's not, we're not there. The political inertia, I think, comes from the fact, and it's borne out in that study tested, it's not the key issue for the voters. And it won't be on the time scales that we need it to be in order to save the planet and save ourselves. So actually what we need is politicians to take action that will get them voted out of power. And that has to also be, it's not actions that are like radically hiking the carbon tax or something, like, it's actions that are putting power back into the hands of communities and, genuinely reshaping the political system, re-empowering local councils so that they're able to actually, rather than instrumentalize communities, they're actually able to give communities the resources that they need to steer their own ships. So yeah, it has to come from the top down, but the top down has, we have to reconsider this expectation that everything's going to be delivered by the private sector and the communities are simply recipients of whatever comes, because that'll just fail. So, and do Green Party slow it down? To be honest, I think the idea of a Green Party when they came about were very important. I think now we're in a time when, we saw so many different politicians of so many different stripes making very good interventions, not just here in Ireland, but around Europe and around the world, about climate during COP. So, the major environmental crises that we face are now better understood by a broader range of parties. And I think that's a positive thing. I don't think I could say any individual party slows it down, but I think parties that focus on market-based approaches primarily do slow down the transformation that's necessary.
Thanks, Sean. Teresa, what do you think? It was you who said communities don't be waiting for the government. In fact, the government present barriers.
Yeah, I mean, that's was what I read. That stuck out to me when I read that piece about transition. And it was like, we'd be a long time waiting for the governments to take action because it's not going to affect them. It won't impact them. And it comes back to, okay, working on local stuff, but then the government is a blocker to what you want to work on at local level. So exactly what Sean says, we need the supports at local level for communities to do things, to change things, to be more resilient and to implement climate action. It's like, they're okay giving out funds for, I don't know, the Children's Hospital. Let's not mention the Children's Hospital. Billions will go into that. Wasted, probably, when that sort of money gone to communities around the country that could possibly have worked on local better transport solutions, that could have worked on local food markets, in putting in markets, solar power, any sort of hydropower, building the vision that there are so many people in this country with. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's so many activists in this country and so many people who know what we need, where we need to be going, but there are so many blockages at government level, and the councils who are well placed to support communities in the transition don't have the resources, and they don't have the democratic process. And I remember when I first represented the environment on a council committee, the training we got was the only person who will change anything is the councillor that is about to retire. So if you want to rock the boat, the person you need to rock the boat is the one that doesn't care about getting no votes or doesn't care about the council staff not doing what they want. If their potholes aren't fixed next term, it doesn't matter because they don't want to get back in again. So it's all about who's willing to rock the boat. And I'll always remember Alex White. He was the Minister for Energy for a few years. He didn't get back in. If he got back in, the National Energy Transition Plan might actually have been implemented properly with more public participation in it. But he was concentrated on, he cared very much about climate change and public participation. And he never got voted back in. You know, so it's the people that rock the boat don't get back in, and that's unfortunate because we need people to rock the boat, very much so now.
Thanks, Teresa. Vincenza?
Yeah, I agree that, you know, that the change isn't going to come from, you know, big politicians, the big politics and government. But yeah, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't hold them accountable and we shouldn't demand things from them as well. Like, I think, yeah, it needs to change from like asking, you know, like, or begging for this to happen, to say, you know, we have the power, like, you know, in collective, in community, and like, we're telling you to do this, you know, and like, yeah, so they're in a position where they have to do it, you know, and I think that that's where our power lies, and that's where, yeah, we can push.
Yeah. So I suppose we're coming close to the end time for our session. But one of the things I wanted to ask you all at this point is, we've had 3 sessions just this last couple of months, all about climate justice. And there have been other, every year there's a first Wednesday on climate justice, I think. Or maybe I'm wrong about that, but there have been a few anyway, I know. And I'm just wondering, so what do you want from COLOV, or what do you think COLOV should be doing, or the people who are hooking in here now? What should we, for the next like 6 months, or if we were to do something, what would you have us do or get involved in, or how would you direct us around all of this in terms of holding governments to account, or, you know, working at a local level, or getting involved in bigger global campaigns, or yeah, what would you have us do? Yeah, that's it. Oh, a small, easy question.
I think for me, I'd start a campaign against Ireland's acting as a tax haven. Like, you know, ultimately, whatever we do on the climate, we're only the size of the suburb of San Francisco, you know, but how we treat, how we, you know, enable tax evasion is in fact taking money out of the pockets of countries all over the world to fight the climate crisis. The average corporate tax rate in Europe in 1990 was 40%. It's now somewhere closer to about 14, and we've led that race to the bottom. Now, if you still had 40% tax on corporations across Europe, we wouldn't be talking about mobilizing the private sector in order to tackle climate change. We'd just be doing it with the capital that we were raising through our taxes, you know. And so, you know, we need a corporate tax floor. Ireland needs to stop acting like a corporate tax haven. We have to get very real about taxing those very wealthy people so that we can use that money to fight these interconnected challenges of healthcare, housing, climate, whatever the issue is. But yeah, so I think really making it unpopular for Ireland to be a tax haven would be a very exciting thing to do.
Very interesting, Sean. Thanks very much. Vincenza?
Yeah, I think there's so many amazing, you know, groups and collectives like in Ireland, you know, that you can get involved with who have like a really strong analysis of power, you know, and want to build collective power in like non-hierarchical ways as well, because, you know, we can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, you know. It's we need to like look at our group culture and how we're organizing together. So like, yeah, there's just loads, too many to name maybe, you know, here. But I think one of the main things I would encourage people to do is to, be aware of like the greenwashing claims coming from the mining industry and how that's being put into climate action plans and all of those kind of things, but also to support frontline communities. And solidarity with frontline communities, I think, is the most important thing. And I know in COLOV that, that's an amazing part of the network, and international solidarity is a really strong part of that as well. But because there's so many frontline communities in Ireland, you know, and to think as well beyond the border, to think in an all island way is really important. And we know at the minute, you know, that in the north here, there could be, you know, the acceptance of 2 huge licenses for petroleum extraction before Christmas. So like, I would encourage everybody to, you know, engage with that and support, you know, the communities in Fermanagh and around Lough Neagh that are facing the threat of fracking and oil and gas drilling at the minute. And to support those communities facing mining, and get involved with those struggles, you know, because we need everyone involved.
And so that for people to access all of that kind of those groups and communities, is it through social media? Is that the best way?
Yeah, there's loads of different groups, like the Environmental Gathering in the north, like they would be sort of like a network for all of those different communities to come together. You can find it online if you have a search. Yeah.
Thanks, Vincenza. Teresa, what about you? What would you have us doing?
Well, when I came away from COP, the one thing I did want to pursue was Commissioner for Future Generations. Now, I do want to follow up, because we had the Welsh Commissioner was at one of the round tables I was at. I'd love to know how far she's getting with that. I think she's only there a year, but there seems to be a lot of good stuff coming out of it. They've also lowered the voting age to 16.
Tell us a little bit more about what that Commissioner for Future Generations is.
So it's her, I took down notes on it. I think it's Future Generations something or other is the website for it. And basically it is a checklist put into different policies to look forward to the future. So it's bringing Wales more in line with the native indigenous peoples that look 7 generations ahead, which is what we need to be doing, is looking 7 generations ahead. If we'd been doing that all the time, we mightn't be in this mess. So that's kind of what Wales have put in this Commissioner for Future Generations. And we need to explore how that might work, and not necessarily just a national body, but at every local authority level, we should have someone who's looking out for, everyone. And the younger the voting age, there is so much more empathy with our young people, with the people that are already struggling in the global south, and all of the injustices that are going on already. And by bringing them into the voting, you will automatically bring that empathy into the decision making. So I'd like to see that happening. I would like to see more concern given, a structured approach to ensuring that future generations are accommodated and considered in all policy that's being made, because they're just not. The financial transaction tax was another thing I took away from recently. So we should not be proud of the fact that we've been a tax haven and we're now a data haven with all these data centers, and we allow ourselves be used to generate profit for a few people in this whole world, and Ireland should not be proud of that. Financial transaction tax would be a point of a percentage of all these big transactions. So when Bezos goes off somewhere and puts a financial transaction of 2 billion, a certain couple of 100,000 would go into this pocket, and that might pay for it. If people weren't so worried about housing and all the other issues that they have to worry about, they might actually have space in their heads for climate. And until the financial inequality is broken down, I think I agree with Sean that we're not going to get anywhere. People are so ground into this system. Financially, they're suppressed. I mean, the poverty trap you can't get out of. It's very hard to think of anything else if you're wondering where your next meal is coming from. So I think there's a much bigger picture, and I would like to see Ireland address that, the inequality. So that'd be my takeaway. My big takeaway from COP was that Commissioner for Future Generations.
Okay, it's really interesting. And that was a point that Shirley made at our last, actually that was core to her contribution at our last First Wednesday, that whole thing about thinking, it's back to that future present, but it's also about actually that long-term, really serious long-term thinking and kind of conservation and protection and minding the world for the future in that kind of long-term way. And I heard the other points that you were making there as well.
Could I just give a bit of good news?
Please. Sorry, Sean, I'm not going to finish without giving you last words.
No, but just on the Commissioner for Future Generations. So we did some work on that previously with the Mary Robbins Foundation at within the UN system, and just a month ago, it hasn't really been publicized, but the Secretary General brought out a paper called Our Common Agenda, and he is committed to establishing a committee on future generations within the UN system, which would actually repurpose the Trusteeship Council, which was the council tasked with overseeing decolonialization in whatever way that it actually did that. That's to be debated. But it's the symbolism of the Committee for Future Generations being a repurposing of the Trusteeship Council is quite significant, because it links reparations with future generations, which could be powerful. So that's a bit of positive news on that, Teresa.
Yeah. Thanks, Sean. Just one comment that's came in there from Francesca Loughran. Thanks very much for it. It's completely with you on taxing corporations. Not enough focus ever on holding private sector accountable. Virtually nothing on this in the 2022 the Climate Action Plan. So just thanks very much for that, Francesca. Any last words or comments before we wrap up? We usually wrap up around this time. I'm not asking you to summarize, or I'm not asking you to reduce. Just wondering if anybody wants to say anything before we sign off today. Feel free to just pop in yourselves if you want.
Maybe just
still worn out. Sorry, Vincenza.
No, go ahead, Teresa.
If this is about COP, we're probably just sick and tired of talking about COP, and it's in our heads for the last, it must be a month now at this stage. But thank you very much, Eilish, for the invite and for the opportunity to talk about it. It's brilliant to share these ideas. So thank you. And thank you guys for that insight.
One thing that I'd say that might be a really interesting thing to try to do, one thing we're going to work on between now and with the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative between now and COP23 is a COP decision focused on children and young people. That's never happened in the 30-year history of COP. And one of the elements of that decision might be to look at creating child-friendly versions of all the literature and, all of the decisions that get taken. Now, I've been thinking about this since, and, every government should be tasked with creating child-friendly versions of any legislation to really start to break down that barrier that exists between people and legislation. Because obviously child-friendly versions would be beneficial to us all, not just the children. And so really making it understandable and accessible. So we're looking into doing that within the UNFCCC, but actually that would be a really interesting thing for the Oireachtas to do as well, to have a committee that looked at making child-friendly versions of all legislation.
That is really interesting. Thanks, Sean. Vincenza, you wanted to say something there as well, I think.
Yeah, no, just briefly, thanks to Teresa and Sean as well. It's really interesting. I just wanted to highlight as well, that I think true solutions come from impacted communities and the alternatives that they're actually embodying on the ground. And I think it's really inspirational at the minute. You see a lot of communities in the north and across the island as well that are opposing mining. They are talking about the rights of nature, and they've been passing motions through their councils to support this idea, that nature isn't just an external thing, an object out there, but it's like a living, sentient thing, and it does come from indigenous ontologies and, different worldviews. And that's something that they're trying to embed into every decision-making process in their local areas, to speak for, not to speak for, but to, advocate on behalf of the rivers and the mountains and the biodiversity. So I think there's some really exciting proposals coming out of impacted communities that we can learn from and reflect on as well.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Listen, thanks very much to all of you. So many really challenging and really interesting ideas there, and examples of change making. And I really think that's really powerful and very strong. One of the things that really struck me from this evening's session is just how intersectional all of this is. And that sounds like a big word and everything, but it's like we've talked about tax, data havens, vaccine inequality. We've talked about public transport. We've talked about holding governments to account. We've talked about the need for neoliberal, the systems, the whole thing about actually changing the systems. You were just after talking about indigenous ontologies, and then you explained that, which is really helpful. The whole world views, that people have different world views, seventh generation talking. It's about everything. But by me highlighting that it's about everything doesn't reduce it to nothing, because you've also highlighted specifics, very specific things that can be done. And even that thing there about translating policy into language for children. And in theory, if you said that, somebody would think you were wacky, Sean, to be honest with you, unless you explained what the implications of all of that potentially are. And the very same for you, Teresa, when you were talking about the 16-year-olds voting. And what I've heard from you guys is to actually think about things, to try and think about things differently, but also to look at the implications of all of that for potential changed systems, which for me is the nub of the whole thing. And I think you've highlighted it very well. And one of the things I leave this evening with is that whole thing about we need people who rock the boat, and boat rockers, basically. And to think and to do this, as you were saying, Vincenza, in a way that's congruent. So, it's back to Audre Lorde's thing about you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. So needing to actually engage very much with people who are directly impacted by all of this and who have other ways of living and thinking and building resilience. So honestly, I found it really, really interesting and very engaging, very challenging, of course, because it's not all easily solvable or anything, and none of you are suggesting that, but at the same time, there are things that can actively be done. So thanks for all of your really insightful and, you know, really considered reflections and thoughts and contributions this evening. It's been fantastic. And thanks also for the suggestions around resources and stuff like that. And I'm sure people will have found them really helpful. So yeah, I think we'll call it an evening, and no doubt we'll be back on this topic again, no doubt in the future. So thanks to COLOV for all their organising of all of this, and to all of you.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you. Bye.